I guess while we're just getting started here, I'll just talk about like what made me interested in this topic. And so my kids, they watch this like Bright Side and infographic show and all this type of stuff on YouTube. It's like little cartoons and stuff. And so one day, I like on my YouTube feed thing, this video pops up, and it's called Jungle King, right? And I'm like, what is this? You know? So sometimes I click on their little cartoons just to see, you know, what kind of things they watch. And there's this story of this African American GI who basically was sick and tired of how he was being treated in the military, shot his commanding officer, and then fled into the jungles between Burma and India amongst the Naga people, who's a headhunting tribe of people who live out there. And he survived for like a year out there. And he escaped. They captured him once and he escaped, and he almost got captured again. He escaped. He got shot multiple times. And it was like, I was like so fascinated by the story. I just loved it. I was so intrigued. So I decided to go get the book. I looked it up. I Googled the book, and then here's the book right here. Now the Hell Will Start. And it just details his life experience. So this presentation is pretty much going to be majority taken from this book, but then I'm also going to touch on other things associated with this subject. And it also started to make me think like just about the context of the whole thing. Like, why am I so, I've never been interested in World War II, ever. Like it was just something that never fascinated me. But now when reading this, it was like his story was something that really like piqued my interest. And I started digging deeper into World War II history and some of what was going on out there. And so I was also going through my stuff recently, my old papers and that I have in boxes in the garage. And I found an old report card of mine, and it was from 8th grade. And in my US history class, I had an F. And I was like, okay, now made me start to reflect. Like, I'm a history teacher now. How do I have an F in history 25 years ago? Or whatever, how many years ago that was, 23 years ago. So it made me start to think about the book that I just purchased, start to think about this whole story about Herman Perry, the Black GI who kills his commanding officer and flees into the jungle. And I started thinking about the type of stuff we learned in my US history class in 8th grade that I was never really interested in. And so I decided to entitle this presentation, Perry or Patton. Patton being George Patton, 4-star general. Perry being Herman Perry. And the story of Herman Perry and why so-called Black heroes conflict with so-called white heroes in history. And I'm not even gonna get into Patton at all. It's not about him, but I thought it would be a catchy title to kind of juxtapose the type of history that we tend to learn in history classes and the type of history that people like me and a lot of my friends who I've told this story to have been very interested in. All right, so first I'd like to thank my kids for watching infographic show and all these little cartoons and stuff. If it wasn't for them, I would never have found this story out. But why Perry or Patton, right? So the thing is, one of the things I want to touch on is like why it is that a lot of our young children are so bored with history and so bored with some of these stories that they get in the classes, the glorification of certain individuals over others. This presentation is going to really like get into some of these things, and it's also going to get into, you know, some of the some of the nuances in history in general. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why I teach the classes the way I teach them today, because of these things. So, we all know a little bit about George Patton. He's a 4-star general. He was a captain in World War I. He was a general in the Army in World War II. He was like the greatest military strategist behind MacArthur and all this kind of stuff, right? Stuff that never really fascinated me growing up. But Herman Perry, on the other hand, Herman Perry, he was executed by military court-martial for shooting a commanding officer. Why is he so interesting to me was the question I had to ask myself over Patton. Why did this guy's story make me want to go research? How can one possibly consider this man a hero? It's a mutiny, basically. He was insubordinate. He killed a man in cold blood, is what the Army said. Well, what was going on during this time that compelled this man to do this to this commanding officer by the name of Harold Cady? So what we're going to talk about today, basically, here's the agenda: life of Herman Perry, which is mostly detailed in this book, Perry's experience in the context of World War II, why contemporary Blacks cheered Perry, and then we're going to get into, once we stop talking about, the book, we're going to also get into why Blacks have historically allied themselves with the enemy of this country, generally speaking. How this is connected to a distrust for the system that we still see today. So who's Herman Perry? Herman Perry was born on May 16th, 1922, right outside of Monroe, North Carolina, which, he was basically came from a sharecropping family. He lived in a house with 4 siblings, his mom, grandparents, as well as uncle and aunt. And it wasn't even, I don't even want to say lived in a house, but it was like a shack that they lived in. They were poor sharecroppers I think they were picking cotton. And this was like all throughout the 1920s up into the 30s during the Great Depression and all that kind of stuff, right? So, but it was right around 1935 or 36, his mom migrated up north to Washington, D.C. Then eventually Perry and his siblings followed suit. So Perry actually dropped out of school, I think when he was in 7th or 8th grade. 7th or 8th grade, he decides, you know what, he's going to quit school and just go head up there to Washington, D.C. to be with his mother. But he didn't end up staying with his mom. He ended up basically finding a job. He worked as a butcher, and then he was able to get his own place and survive like that. But Perry was a very outgoing, happy young man. Washington, D.C. at this time, it was a place where a lot of Blacks from the South were moving in such large numbers, but there was segregation in the town as well as classism, right? So you had a lot of Black people who had been living in D.C. for generations and generations, who were kind of part of the upper class or the elite class of Blacks in the area, but then at the same, the bourgeoisie, but then you had a lot of the lower class Blacks coming from sharecropping families in the Deep South. That's what Perry was a part of. And so when it came to getting jobs and stuff, people like Perry had a tough time unless they were willing to kind of really undercut the wages of some of the others and work for very, very meager wages. But nevertheless, he was able to get a job and keep a job as a butcher. Just like a lot of the Black teens in those days, he went to dances and stuff. He He played dice, and he just basically hung out and had fun. He had a girlfriend that he ended up having a baby with at one point. Things didn't work out with this girlfriend, but he met another woman by the name of Alma Talbot that he ended up having a serious relationship with. But DC was still kind of like a segregated city, and the realities of segregation was there. It wasn't as segregated as where they had come from, but it was still a segregated part of the country, right, where they still experience their share of racism and things like that. So he was also, a lot of the people that interviewed the family members of Perry and stuff like that, he was known as like a very happy-go-lucky, high-spirited playboy kind of guy that just kind of like got all the girls and got a lot of attention from the ladies and stuff like that. But then one day, you had this act was passed, the Burke-Wadsworth Act, or also known as the Selective Training and Service Act of 1940. All right, so now we weren't technically involved in World War II yet at this time, but we were starting to get people ready to start training just in case. So Selective Service Act, also known as the draft, basically required that all people of a certain age, men of a certain age, register for the draft. And so Perry was one of them. There were actually a lot of the people in DC, the draft board in DC they were kind of thinking that a lot of African Americans would not register for this draft because there were a lot of newspapers like the Chicago Defender and some other newspapers that were actually, despite the fact that we learned about this whole WWII campaign where Black people were really encouraged to fight in the war because they were thinking, well, we can have a victory abroad as well as having a victory at home if we fight. But some of these newspapers, these Black newspapers, actually published articles talking about African Americans possibly becoming conscientious objectors to the military and saying, basically, we have our beliefs and we have our rights here as African Americans, and we understand that we're not treated as full citizens. And so therefore, we conscientiously realize that we don't have to fight or should not have to fight for this country. Some of these newspapers were publishing articles like this, and J. Edgar Hoover was started to investigate some of these writers and things like that at the time. And so there was a concern that a lot of the African Americans in DC weren't going to actually register for the draft. But one of the ways in which they kind of got them to do so was by stating that we weren't going to, the whole isolationist attitude that some Americans had, we weren't going to send any troops abroad to fight in foreign wars. If anything, these troops would only be sent to defend American territories, right? So we'd either be sent in places to defend our own borders or to defend some of our in territories overseas, like the Philippines or Guam or Puerto Rico and stuff like that. So this was a way to try to get some of the people on this to basically register without resistance. But surprisingly, a lot of the African Americans in Washington, D.C. did actually register. And there was no real big pushback that they thought they might have at the time, at that moment. So Perry was one of them that registered. He did as a citizen supposed to do. He registered and he did his thing. A few months later, he gets a phone call. He's scheduled for a physical. And so the draft board calls him and schedules him for his physical on February 5th, 1941. But Perry, he doesn't show up. So when he doesn't show up, promptly, just a few weeks later, police come to Perry's home and they arrest him. So Perry ends up spending about 2 to 3 months in jail while they're trying to sift through all the paperwork, and the prosecutors are trying to get him on some charges and things like that. But ultimately, the prosecutors end up dropping this case, and Perry is released from jail. But he was in jail for about 3 months as a young man, 18-year-old, more or less. And he's with like killers and rapists and drug dealers and all kinds of stuff in the jail. And they say that this also had a profound effect on his psyche at the time, right? So then Perry, when he gets out, he basically lost 2 to 3 months worth of work in the butcher shop, and but he goes back to work. His job is still there. He goes back to work. He does his thing for a while, and he still spending time with his new girlfriend, Alma Talbot, and he's just living life. Then he gets the next call, July 29th, 1942. This time he shows up for the physical. He doesn't want to spend any more time in jail. So he's chosen for the 849th Engineer Battalion, and he's basically he goes to training in New York, Camp Kilmer, and he spends some time. Can't remember exactly how long he spent out there, but when he was out there, he realized that being an African American in the military wasn't all that it was cracked out to be, right? A lot of the white commanding officers severely mistreated a lot of the African American trainees. There was a lot of, they even talked about in the book, they talked about a lot of like riots and fights going on in different places, not only in where Perry was located, but all throughout the country. They even talked about the fact that in some cases, it seemed like African American soldiers who were drafted had to fight more of a war against whites within their country than they were going to fight whites abroad or Japanese people abroad. So the lieutenant colonel of the 849th Engineer Battalion was Colonel Wright Hyatt, and he was somewhat sympathetic. He's going to come back later on in the story, and this is the reason why I'm presenting him here. But he was somewhat of a sympathetic kind of colonel. So he's one guy that Perry kind of felt like he can trust to a certain extent. Yeah, so this is basically what I was just saying. They're at Camp Kilmer, and there was a major riot before their departure. Their departure to get sent out to Asia. See, at first, they didn't know exactly where they're going to be sent. Perry had no knowledge of like any other details about World War II or anything like that. But when he found out, they basically, a lot of the soldiers basically were kind of like the lieutenants at the time were looking at a lot of the black soldiers, the black troops, as being kind of resistant to the idea that they're going to be sent abroad to fight in this war that they really knew nothing about. So in the day leading up to them taking a train to the station or to the port where they're going to embark, a lot of them were started to like riot and fight and do all this kind of stuff. So I put right here in this slide, it has wars between black and white soldiers in the 364th Infantry. So this was going on. This is one of the camps right around 1942 or 43, I think it was, where black and white soldiers were literally killing each other, like engaging in like drive-bys and stuff like that. So they mentioned this in the book as well, which I thought was pretty fascinating, because it was like the blacks were pretty much having to deal with basically an enemy within their own territory before they're getting sent out. And the soldiers and the people in Camp Kilmer, Perry and others included, heard about these events. So they were like, why are we going to go fight in this war abroad when these whites in this country are always trying to fight and hurt us here? But nevertheless, they got sent off in the USS West Point. And even on the ship, the experience on the ship was also very negative. They were usually confined to the very bottom of the ship. white soldiers had the opportunity to be able to go up and, get fresh air on deck, where black soldiers usually confined to the bottom for long periods of time. So it was a very demeaning experience for a lot of them leading up to this point. Now, this was what they call the CBI theater of World War II. And this is the part of the war that nobody really ever even talks about or really knows about. So when we talk about World War II, we usually talk about either the Germans, the Italians, the Japanese, but we never really get into this part: India, Burma, China. So the thing was this: the whole purpose of the American engineers and troops being stationed in this region was for the fact that the United States and Britain were trying to supply China with weapons, right? The Chinese were supposed to be our allies at this time, because the Chinese had pretty much had sold out to a lot of the imperialists ever since the 19th century. So if you look at the Japanese, on the other hand, the Japanese had gone into this part of Asia and had conquered parts of China. The Japanese were continuing to try to conquer other parts of China and invade farther and farther. And even at this time, by the 1940s, they were trying to conquer beyond China, and had invaded Burma, had gone into French Indochina, eventually the Philippines, and then continued to expand their empire. The United States and Britain wanted to put a stop to this. So India, being a British colony, was a place where their ally, the United States, can pretty much establish their troops and basically try to build a road called the Ledo Road that would lead from India through Burma into China. And through this road, we can establish weapons and send these weapons to the Chinese so they can defend themselves against the Japanese. This is the plan, right? Right around where they're building this road, there is a group of Naga, which we'll come back and talk about a little bit more later. Naga village people who are pretty much like, they live a very simple life. They're farmers, but they also engage in what they call headhunting, right? So they're a headhunting tribe of people that live in the hills, the Naga hills, right between the borders of Burma and India. There's also the coolie, which is a term that they use to refer to Indian indentured labor that was also being used to build this road. So nevertheless, once Perry and his other African-American engineers end up disembarking in India, they realized that their task as an engineer was just a euphemism to describe what they really were, and that was just a laborer in the middle of the jungle. They realized quickly that all the officers, commanding officers, were white, and a large portion of those constructing this road in the middle of the jungle with malaria, leeches, tigers, all kinds of crazy stuff, were Black. There was a clear racial hierarchy. There was a quote in the book where, I think I have it on the next slide, actually. No. Where basically they're comparing it to chattel slavery. Perry, who was an individual who did not know anything about the war, did not have a feeling about fighting in this war, and when he refused to even go to the original physical exam, went to jail for refusing, finally complies with the draft, gets sent on the ship, and goes to the middle of the jungle in a place he's never even heard of, Burma, to be working 16-hour shifts from can't see in the morning till can't see at night to construct this road, this 465-mile road going through India, Burma, and China. It was his task, as well as others, to crush rocks and clear the jungle rot with knives and machetes. They had pickaxes and things like that. And while the commanding officers and white officers were driving bulldozers and things like that, the blacks are basically on the road dealing with leeches, all types of jungle parasites, which got a lot of these soldiers very sick, what got a lot of these engineers very sick. Of the 15,000 troops assigned to the road, 2/3 or more were black. The officers were all white. A lot of the soldiers quickly realized that, this ain't right. A lot of the engineers, I should say, quickly realized that this ain't right. They definitely, the white officers would brutalize a lot of the black engineers for not acting quick enough, or refusing absurd orders, or they would end up getting thrown into the stockade for petty reasons. And Perry was actually a victim of this as well. In the book, Brendan Corner, the author, he writes, Perry had come to loathe not just the jungle's hardships, but also the officers who treated him like chattel. See, this is his experience in World War II, right? Someone who gets brought from America, hustling to provide for his daughter, hustling to live the American dream, but he gets drafted and he gets put out there in the middle of the jungle and treated virtually as a slave. And there's another sad part about the Ledo Road that was supposed to be constructed between India, Burma, and China, was that they had come up with better ideas to send weapons to China through airplane. But there was a guy by the name of Stilwell, Lieutenant Colonel Stilwell, who insisted upon having this road built. And this had something to do with his run-ins with the Japanese earlier on in the war. Perry fell ill early on as an experience. They say almost 99% of the engineers caught malaria. And they struggled. But they put them right back out to work, 16-hour shifts with the pickaxe, with the knife, with the machete, working alongside the coolies who were the indentured labor employed by the British. After Perry fell ill, he was sent to the Ledo Stockade for 3 months because refusing to follow orders. They're not sure exactly what it was that he did, but it was something pretty petty. Like, officer commanded him to do something specifically, and he refused to do it the exact way he was commanded to do it. He spends 3 months in the stockade, and he explains, when he was interviewed after he was captured later on, he explains how this was like one of the worst experiences in his life. So not only does he spend 2 to 3 months in jail in the United States, but now the military assigns him, puts him in the stockade for 3 months. And he said there was such horrible treatment in the stockade. So when he finally was released, and then what made matters worse, when he was in the stockade, he was supposed to get out after 2 months. And for no explanatory reason, they kept him in there for an extra month. He was then the same when he got out. When he got out, he coped by using marijuana, even opium. And he spent a lot of his time sneaking out, getting high. When a lot of people think of some of the American wars, we think Vietnam's the one where people got all addicted and high and all this stuff. But World War II had its case of, substance abuse as well. Because the people that were employed in these kind of conditions, I mean, that was their escapism. So this is where it all goes downhill. So Perry had, he was sneaking out, getting high and everything like that. And keep in mind, these black engineers, they were surviving off of like it was $2 a day that they were making, right? It costs like about like $1 for some razors to shave. It costs about $1 to get a soup, a chicken soup, a canned chicken soup. The commanding white officers typically made about $10 a day. All right. So this just goes to show you like also the discrepancy and the difference between what the black engineers made and the white officers made. So a lot of the blacks also kind of resorted to like a black market trade, and they would steal things off the back of trucks and stuff like that and sell things. So they had their own way of surviving and making their money out there in the jungle. So nevertheless, it was in one day, Perry, 1944. I think it was March 4th, 1944, March 3rd, 1944. Perry, he was so high, he fails to wake up to go out there and do his duties, his pickaxe duty. So he just sleeps in the whole day. Then someone spotted him just kind of roaming around, walking around like nothing ever happened. And one of the commanding officers basically says, you know what? Go get your stuff, pack up your stuff, turn your stuff in. You're going to the Stockade. Perry said, I ain't going to no Stockade again. It's not happening. So they sent a few of the MPs, the military police, to kind of escort him out there. He said, go get your stuff, turn your stuff in. You're going to the Stockade. So Perry, he goes under the MP's orders to go get his stuff. He goes into his little area, his little bed area, and he gets his stuff, and he grabs his M1 rifle. See, all of them were assigned rifles. And that night before, he had loaded the rifle. So they were like, what are you going to do with that? He's like, I'm going to turn my stuff in. But the way Perry was holding, according to the book, the way Perry was holding the rifle, it looked like he wanted to do something with it. So they were like all kind of scared, like, all right, just go ahead and just turn your stuff in, and someone will escort you to to where you need to go in order to get to the Stockade. So Perry basically was like, you know what? I'm not going. This ain't gonna happen in my lifetime. If I go back to the Stockade, like, he's gonna go nuts. He's gonna go crazy. So what Perry ends up doing, he's just like, all right. He basically shows the gun in a kind of like an intimidating way. He's like, I'm gonna speak to Lieutenant Colonel Hyatt. That's the sympathetic one I told you about earlier. Because he actually spoke to him a little bit earlier, a couple weeks earlier, and Hyatt said, if you ever experiencing anything wrong, just come talk to me before anything else happens to you. So he said he told the MPs that. So Perry's basically is like, you know what, I'm gonna go and talk to Hyatt. So he goes on his way to talk to Hyatt, and some of the other MPs are just like, just let him go, because this guy looks like he's mad right now. And then they realize they're gonna have to send off for some other people to actually put a stop to him, because a couple of guys that they had surrounded him, they weren't about that life. So he goes off. He starts walking down the road towards Hyatt. One of the lieutenants, Lieutenant Harold Cady, who was originally there trying to get him to turn in his gun. Harold Cady later on went on a mission to do something else and ends up passing Perry on the road. And he stops and he says, "Where are you going?" And Perry's like, "I'm going to talk to Hyatt." He's like, "No, get in the truck right now. I'm taking you to the Stockade." So Perry's like, "No, I'm not." And then so Cady foolishly starts to walk towards Perry and say, "No, give me your gun right now." And he's like, throwing all types of insults, trying to act bad and everything towards Perry. And Perry's like, "You step one step closer, it's not going to be pretty." So what does Cady do? He takes a step closer and tries to grab the rifle. Perry shoots him twice in the chest. Cady's grasping for air for a little bit, and then he eventually dies, right? Now, there were a couple of witnesses that saw all this happen. And as soon as Perry shoots Cady, people are freaking out, like, did he just really do that? So Perry immediately flees into the jungle and just runs and just doesn't turn back. So this is the beginning of the manhunt. Now, the jungle that Perry ran into was full of tigers. But not only that, it was full of an ethnic group known as the Naga. This image that you see right here, if you look closely, you see these skulls around this bag that he's holding. That was common. The Naga were people that they say originally migrated from the Tibet region of Asia about like 2,000 years ago. And they migrated to the hills of between Burma and India. And they call it Nagaland, Naga country. But the Naga, they're not one unified ethnic group, right? It's like, it's a term that's kind of used to describe culturally this migration of people that came from this region. But they're divided into tribes and sub-tribes and villages and sub-villages and all that kind of stuff. So there's no unified Naga tribe. But ever since the British tried to colonize India and Burma way back in the day, in the 1830s, 1840s, there was always a resistance from the Naga. And it was a fear of the Naga because the Naga were very sneaky, crafty. They would hide in the bushes and just sneak out and start cutting people's heads off and take their skulls and take it back. And then hang their skulls up on their walls and in their villages and stuff like that. They're a very isolated, insulated group. If you were the outsider, you were the enemy. They were good to their own kind, but to the outsiders, no. And so there was also a lot of intertribal Naga warfare. Like I said, there was tribes and sub-tribes and all that stuff. So the distinction was not as clear cut that someone from the West could really understand. So a lot of people didn't really know and understand like what Naga was which. But the further away you were from the top of those mountains, the Naga were more supposedly civilized and more westernized. But the higher you got on those hills, the more quote unquote primitive they were, and the more likely they were to be headhunters. Well, the place that Herman Perry ran into was the more headhunting primitive group of Naga, known as Tugumga. Tugumga was what they were referred to as, but Herman Perry can never say the word, so we just called them the Glau. Herman Perry had become a modern day Maroon. Now, before he ended up coming into contact with the Naga, he spent about 3 or 4 days in the jungle all alone. And he couldn't take it anymore. He was getting sick. He was hungry. And so he decided to turn himself in. So he went to the Namyang Bridge to turn himself in, hoping somebody would come up on him. And he didn't want to seem threatening. So he put down his rifle and he said, just waited for someone to find him. No one would find him. But then he heard shots, boom, 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 and he just freaked out and started running. At this point is when Herman Perry realized, I'm just going to keep going. And he kept going, and this is when he ended up stumbling upon the Naga village. And when he entered into the Naga village, Gunga, which is the headhunting Naga, he saw heads hanging on the outside of some of the huts, and he was like, "What the heck?" He didn't know what to do. I'm gonna skip this section right here because it's basically like a little bit of Naga history. But so what Perry ended up doing, he was lost. He ended up going back out. Once he entered into the Naga village, he went back out and he ended up finding some British scouts, basically, out there in the jungles. And he was a really, like, Herman Perry was a really, like, fast talker. He's one of those types that can persuade people easily. We was able to convince these British scouts that he was out there lost as an American scout, and that he needed to get some food rations and some stuff like that to get going, and he needed to help find his way back to his battalion. So these British, individuals believed him. So they gave him some stuff, some food, a knife, and some things to help him for a few days. Herman Perry ended up taking this same stuff back to the Naga village, food rations, canned goods, stuff like that, knives and stuff like that. And he ended up, kind of like in a very non-threatening manner, showing them, look, I have some stuff for you, to the Naga people. The Naga people end up loving Herman Perry. Before you know it, Herman Perry had become a part of the family. Herman Perry also remained in connection with some of the black GIs. A lot of the black GIs were rooting Herman Perry on. So he was able to get guns and weapons and things like that from them. They were able to sneak out that stuff for him. And Herman Perry brought that stuff back to the Naga village. So they liked Herman Perry because he was the man that brought the food and brought the weapons. But a lot of the black GIs, even though they were encouraging Herman Perry and they were supporting him, they didn't want to obviously get in trouble. So how long can this last, right? So Herman Perry realizes he has to think quick. He can't just depend upon the outside rations that he's getting from the GIs or some of the weapons that he's smuggling in from the GIs. He has to find a way to really become a part of the family. So he ends up marrying the Ang, which is the chief. He marries the chief's daughter, who, by the way, was actually 14 years old. But that's when they start marrying in that society at that young of an age. Herman Perry lives about 3 months with the Naga people. He ends up having his own plot of land. He has his own little plot of rice farm. He's growing his own marijuana. He's growing his own opium, rice. He has his own hut with his own wife, and now she's pregnant. The whole entire time, the reason why they had no clue where he was, because the military assumed that Herman Perry had gone to a major city, Calcutta. They were thinking, oh, of course, this is where an urban DC black young fella, he's going to go straight to the city. He's probably going to get some prostitutes and, do that kind of thing. That was their thinking. And a lot of the reports, they use all the black stereotypes. And they assumed that he'd gone to a city full of prostitution, full of gambling, full of all that stuff. And that's where he was going to be. But boy, were they wrong. So yeah, as I mentioned before, uses resources to gain trust and prestige with Naga. He married the Ang's daughter, which is the chief, and he spent 4 months living among the Naga until one day Herman Perry started to get a little reckless. He started going out to the borders of Naga country more often to connect and buy cigarettes and stuff like that. Where another Naga reported seeing him because, Naga out there said they saw a black gentleman in Naga country. And the word got around and it basically got up to the higher ups and they realized that Herman Perry was not in Calcutta. He wasn't in no major city. He was about 8 to 10 miles away from where the 849th Battalion was stationed, but deep into the jungle. The GIs provided weapons, canned goods, alcohol, all kinds of stuff to Herman Perry while he was staying with the Naga people in secret. And this made him a very prominent figure within the community. And he said, for the first time in a long time, he felt like a human being again. By being a member of the military, a draftee, he didn't feel like that. He felt like a chattel. He felt like a slave. Amongst the Naga, he didn't feel that way. And he said, despite the fact that the Naga were a headhunting tribe of people within their own, they were a very loving, caring group. They started to refer to him as the Jungle King. Black GIs all over the place were cheering him on. There were they started putting wanted posters out all over the jungle. And whenever black GIs would come across these wanted posters, they'd tear them up. So, like I mentioned before, authorities received a tip about Perry's location. So Perry found out about this because some of the Nagas reported to him that they're on to you. So Perry ended up going to a subsidiary Naga village just outside. It's called Nkosa. It was just outside of where he was located before, in Tungunga. When he's in this new place, there was a Naga who was connected with the British military, who actually was family, like had some type of family connection to this new place that Perry was located. So he was able to get in there and basically ask Perry for his gun. Perry used to be very generous with his gun. He used to always give it to the Naga people, and they used to do their hunting, and they had to give it back. So he thought that this Naga guy was just one of those other friendly Nagas, but this Naga was an informant, basically, for the British. So they end up he's without his gun. The British and American officers, they come in, they break into one of Perry's his basha or his home, and he flees, he runs, and they shoot him. They shoot him in the chest. But despite the fact that he's shot in the chest, he still continues to flee. He falls down this hill and he ends up near a river. And he's eventually captured. He's interviewed. He's taken to a hospital for a little bit, and then they throw him in the stockade. And then he spends a very long time, I think it was about so from July to December 1944, he spends in the stockade while he's healing and everything and reflecting. Now, he ends up going to trial and he gets sentenced to execution for his crimes. But while he's waiting in this stockade, he learns the habits of the security guards, where they walk, how often they walk around the stockade, who's the lazy security guard, who's not. And he figures out the perfect opportune time to flee. He ends up sneaking in, getting certain people to sneak in certain little knife or something for him to be able to cut through wire and stuff like that. So he ends up breaking free, and he's on the run again. And he starts using a lot of the Naga tactics to survive. His popularity continued to grow. He continued to have connections with black GIs who can supply him stuff. This man lost probably like 4 or 5 guns while he was in the jungle, but every time he always ended up getting a new one. When they interviewed Perry about where he was getting these supplies from, that's one thing he would never say. He would never snitch. He would never say where he was getting his supplies. This time, Perry was on his own. He was a lot farther from the Tugumga region. He's on his own. He's basically just squatting in wherever he can find a place to stay every night. Whenever he can, he'll try to make a connection with a black GI that he sees to be able to get some food rations or get some whatever it is that he needs. But his time is running out, right? It's just a matter of time before they catch him. So at one point, he was spotted in a timber camp. And then Herman Perry, he was sleeping, but he's obviously at this time, he's starting to sleep very lightly because he's always on the run. He hears some footsteps of people coming in. And it was these officers that there was a tip basically saying that they spotted a black man in one of the timber camps that might be Herman Perry. And this was miles and miles away from the Ledo Road. This is farther to the western part of that part of India. And he gets up, runs, he flees, he gets shot in the foot, but it was a small flesh wound and he was still able to run. He forgets his pistol once again. Then on February 19th, 1945, still on the run, he ends up, there was a Staff Sergeant, Raymond Toomer and Otto Troxler, who were black individuals who were engaging in basically a black market trade in Makum, which is a part of this part of India. And Perry ends up basically sneaking up behind them with his gun and he forces them to cook him something to eat. And he forces them to give him some other food rations that he could take with him. But he also said to these same black individuals, look, I'm going to come back here in 24 hours. Can you guys provide me with, and he listed like all types of crazy demands, which it's not even understandable how he would even be able to carry all this stuff. But he wanted them to basically bring a truck full of weapons, food, and all this stuff that Perry was going to basically try to take back into the jungle, I guess, to survive. So these two individuals agreed to doing it. Now, at the time, it says, the way it talks about it in the book, they agreed to do it because at first I think they were thinking that might be the right thing to do, but then they realized how much trouble that they would get in if they got caught. And so they decided to basically snitch on Perry. So they set up this plan. This is where the 159th Commander, Major Earl Owen Cullum, gets involved. They set up this plan to basically trap Perry. And Perry knew that this might be a trap. So Perry decided to come up after the 24 hours to the location where Toomer and Troxler were and have this, he ended up using like these Hindu individuals to walk behind them. And because he knew that they wouldn't shoot at the Hindu individuals. And once the Hindu individuals passed by and Herman Perry realized he wasn't getting shot at, then he realized, okay, this is cool. These guys are cool. So Troxler and Toomer say, meet us at the other side of this checkpoint, and then we'll give you the stuff. So Herman Perry says, okay. So Herman Perry goes around to the checkpoint, and this is where Major Cullum is standing there, and they try to trap him at the checkpoint. Perry finds out quickly. Perry runs, he flees, he gets shot in the foot and in the nose, but he continues to run away. And he learns this trick. He learned this trick about stuffing moss into wounds from the Naga. So that's what he did to carry over for the next few hours. But the bleeding was getting bad. He was getting weak, but he was still on the run, still surviving. he tried his one last shot at at hitching a ride, basically, with one of these beer trucks that used to go by. Now, like I said before earlier in the presentation, a lot of the black soldiers were engaged in like black market trading and things like that, because this is their way of making money. They make very meager wages, and they used to sometimes, when these slow riding trucks with beer on the back of it used to drive by, they used to steal it off the back of these trucks. So Perry decided, with the same scheme, basically, is with these slow riding trucks going by, instead of just stealing beer off the back, sneak into one of these trucks behind the crates, hide in those trucks, and wherever that truck takes him, he's going to basically that's going to be his new home. But he wants to get the heck out of this region by any means necessary. So he does this, he tries to do this. He tries to sneak on the back of this slow moving truck, but he misses, he falls, he scrapes himself, he loses his pistol, and it's like, dang. And then people are watching him, and they know they know this is the guy that everybody's looking for. And so this is basically like the end of it for Perry at this point. He's weak from getting shot multiple times. He's hungry. He's just scraped himself by trying to latch onto the back of this truck. So he spends the next few days begging Hindu farmers for food and squatting in people's bashas. And so at the very last day, where Perry would be a free man, he heard, it was in the middle of the night, and he saw that the Cullum and other soldiers were coming from different angles. So Perry decided to go and around a campfire with some Hindu individuals wearing the Dodi. And he said, let me borrow your Dodi. And it was basically like the whole white cloth thing. And he tried to put something in his hair, because at this point his afro got super, super large. It wasn't a low cut that he had before. So he tries to put something in his hair to pin it back so he could look like one of the Indians. Well, that didn't work. They're looking at, Major Cullum is looking at these Hindu individuals around the fire, and something didn't look right. One of them had hair that looked a little bit too fluffy. So Major Cullum says, freeze right there. And then at this point, Perry just kind of gave up and was just like, you know what? You got me. You win. Yeah, at this point, it wasn't worth it anymore. And so this was on March 9th, 1945. And they put him in like maximum security after this, because there's like, this guy keeps sneaking out. And they didn't even tell him the date he was going to be executed. They didn't give him any information. And they were also worried that, because this guy was such a folk hero to a lot of the black GIs, they were worried that there was going to be some type of like riot or mutiny. And so they ended up like increasing security all around where he was staying, and before execution. And then at the time of the execution, in order to avoid it looking like an actual like lynching of a black man in the Deep South, they made sure a lot of the guards were trusted black individuals that were there at the execution. When he was getting ready to be executed, a lot of those white officers actually, some of them, well, Cullum mentions it in a book that he wrote years and years later. Major Cullum, the one that captured him, mentioned how Perry took it like a man, like there no whining, no crying. He just walked up to the gallows and one of the pastors, there was a black pastor there that was supposed to like read him some lines and some stuff. He was all like crying and everything. And Perry was like, man, don't cry. I'm the one being hung. And then they said, Perry, you put on this. They made him put on the little white, whatchamacallit thing over the face to hang him. He said, no, I don't want to. You don't have to put that on me. And they're like, no, you have to put it on. And he says to them, well, I don't want to break any rules. So they put the thing on his head, and then they hang him March 15th, 1945. And they describe it in detail in the book, how it wasn't even a proper noose. like the noose was like not even done properly. So he actually struggled for a really long time before his body stopped moving. But yeah, that was that's Perry's life. And after reading that book, I was just like, dang, like that was so moving. And this is a recent discovery for me. So this is all new to me as well. I'm still trying to figure out why I know why, but I'm trying at the same time trying to figure out why I'm so fascinated by this story now. You know, is something wrong with me? Am I like anti-American or something? Yeah, like from liking this black man that kills this commanding officer. But the thing is, a lot of the black engineers were supportive of Perry. They helped him. They supported him. They smuggled him food, weapons. And it made me think about even when I read the autobiography of Malcolm X, when he was drafted in 1943, one of the things he said to the draft board, he's like, I can't wait to steal us some guns and kill us some crackers. They gave him a 4F. Ineligible for the military. This guy's crazy. It made me think about some of Malcolm X's speeches where he talked about fighting against Hitler and fighting against Tojo and fighting in the military and all this stuff, while at the same time you're being nonviolent at home. What's the real war here, right? And then it also made me think about the context of all of this. When you look at what were we fighting during World War II? Anybody want to chime in here? Generally speaking,
Well, I'll give it a shot.
Yeah.
Well, basically, what World War II was about was a continuation of World War I, which was basically a continuation of European conflicts, right? Between themselves. But the danger was basically you still have imperialism in the ideology, and you had basically Nazi imperialism throughout Europe and Japanese imperialism throughout Asia, and therefore it would create a national security for the United States, right?
Yeah.
So definitely there was meaning to what transpired, and you've seen that we've had peace, relative peace, except for the events around the world based on the Cold War, the Soviet Union, and but the story is fascinating because it's the story of African Americans in the United States being basically enslaved population, and so it's fascinating. It's just amazing, Definitely, I think that I agree that it's sort of like the Civil War, right? And sort of like the Revolutionary War, right?
Yeah.
The African Americans' role in those wars were, what were they fighting for? When in reality, were they fighting for their maybe they were fighting for their freedom, but in reality, in this case, I don't see that, right? They were drafted, they didn't know what was going on. Anyway, yeah. I give it a shot.
Yeah. So you said something there that we're fighting against German imperialism and Japanese imperialism, right? The Germans and the Japanese were spreading their way all across sovereign nations, trying to take over. This became a problem all of a sudden. But why was it a problem all of a sudden when the Germans and Japanese and Italians are doing it? But it was something that the British, the French, the Dutch, the Belgian, and the Americans were already doing. This is a map. This map right here represents the colonies in which these nations possessed. The dark colored pink is the United Kingdom and their colonies. The blue is French and their colonies. The green is the Portuguese and their colonies. The light colored pink is the United, or the darker colored, whatever color, purple, that is the United States and her colonies, right? The Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico, Hawaii, and all that stuff. So why is it all of a sudden wrong? Like, and I asked this question, were the Allies really the good guys? They were just as much invaders of free people as the Germans and the Japanese were. In fact, the only reason why invading sovereign people became an issue is because you were invading white people. In fact, when you invaded, the only reason why the Japanese invading Asian countries was an issue because the Asian countries in which they invaded were the colonies of these white nations. The Philippines belong to the United States. French Indochina, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam belong to the French. Burma belonged to the British. And the list goes on. Indonesia belonged to the Dutch. So why is it all of a sudden an issue? And that's the thing. So, and then it makes you wonder, okay, what were the Japanese invading these countries to control and take them over? Or is it possible the Japanese were anti-imperialists and wanted to kick the Europeans out of Asia? Now, it could be a bit of both, right?
Well, I mean, you're absolutely right. Absolutely right. The Japanese were actually an imperialist nation, right? And they were anti-European Western colonialists. So yes, absolutely. And but you're dealing with a period of imperialism, right? So now we live in a period of nationalism, right? After the end of World War II, we moved into an age of national ethnic self preservation, right? And it was driven by Woodrow Wilson at the end of World War II, where he was trying to say, let people in their ethnic background form their own nation. So now we live in the age of nationalism. So it's difficult to understand the age of imperialism, and it has a lot of flaws and a lot of human abuses. Absolutely, right? It's but if you take that into context, no matter where you go and study history, for example, I saw a couple of the Mongols in Central Asian steppes, right? The way they lived was by raiding other tribes and enslaving their people, killing their men, taking their women, and taking their goods. And it was all throughout Central Asia. And then when you dealt with early European history, you had all these wars that were going on, and so it's just the human nature, I guess.
Yeah.
To, I don't know why, but imperialism was no different, right? It was just a different period in the human evolution of self immortalization. I mean, it's just bad, right?
Yeah. So what I have here is a lot of people don't realize that the Japanese, they had this racial equality proposal at the Paris Peace Conference after World War I, where it basically said that they wanted all members, if nations are going to join the League of Nations, they wanted there to be a racial equality associated with it. So the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia rejected this when the Japanese were going to join. Some people say that this is one of the things that radicalized the Japanese, because they realized these white nations, no matter what they say about like freedom and all that kind of stuff, they don't really mean it if you're not white. So with a lot of African Americans within the United States, ever since the 19 teens and 20s and 30s, people like W.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey and these organizations here, the Pacific Movement of Eastern World, the Moorish Science Temple, and the Eastern Pacific Movement, as well as the UNIA, were all kind of cheering on the Japanese as an anti-colonial group of people. So even when World War II started, African Americans, J. Edgar Hoover was worried because even just in the city of Detroit alone, there was 15,000 members of these various organizations that were pro-Tokyo, pro-Japanese during World War II. Because the way they saw it, that the United States was an imperialist nation based on racism, and the United States was a Jim Crow segregated society. And what would it benefit you to ally yourself or support this cause when the Japanese are the ones who are making a racial appeal? Even though I'm not saying that the Japanese actually meant everything they said, but they were making a racial appeal and reaching across the line. And then another thing I want to add to this is how many blue discharges or blue tickets were given to African-American soldiers after the war to where they couldn't receive the same benefits associated with home loans and education and things like that with the GI Bill. So even like post World War II, this affected people a lot as well. Another point I want to make about the war is that even after the war, we still, white Germans got a pass in many cases, and we end up using a lot of their scientists and doctors under Operation Paperclip. So we end up using them, bringing them to this country under the CIA operation, and then they ended up doing some of the same experiments on American citizens that they had been doing on people in Germany. And one of the things that they also mentioned in the book that I've also read about was like sometimes German prisoners of war were treated better than African American soldiers. They were given better accommodations. So all of these reasons, and they also talk about this Operation Paperclip and other experiments in Harriet Washington's Medical Apartheid, which kind of talks about the dark history of medical experimentation on Black Americans of colonial times to the present. But this talks about the distrust of not only the government, but the medical industry as well. But I say all this to say that there has been a precedent set for this, for African Americans allying themselves with the enemy during war. Even the American Revolutionary War, the majority of Blacks did not fight on the side of the colonists. They fought on the side of the British, right? So for instance, we always learn about Crispus Attucks, and you say he was the first person to die in the American Revolutionary War because he was the first person shot in the Boston Massacre on March 5th, 1770. But that's to shoehorn the African American experience into the American experience. But reality is, if you break down the numbers, it wasn't until the American Revolutionary War started in 1775, Lord Dunmore had his proclamation encouraging African Americans to fight on the side of the British in exchange for their freedom. In November of 1775, the United States didn't start accepting, or the American colonists didn't start accepting Black soldiers into the military to fight until 1778. Because they were desperate for soldiers. 5,000 African Americans fought on the side of the Americans, whereas 20,000 fought on the side of the British. And this goes all the way back to, even if you look at like early history of the experience between the American colonists and the British, the American colonists according to this book by Gerald Horne called The Counter-Revolution of 1776, they started to implement amelioration in some of their colonies, meaning kind of lessening the harshness of slavery. They also started to encourage the conscription of blacks into the military. And there was also the Major Somerset case, which liberated black people in England in 1772. According to Gerald Horne, the historian, he argues that this is what compelled a lot of the American colonists to separate from Britain, because Britain's policies were supposedly getting too liberal for blacks, and the American colonists couldn't take that. The War of 1812 also had a lot of black participation fighting on the side of the British. Black people on the slave ship known as the Creole that was sailing from Virginia to New Orleans, that slave ship, they also steered this ship in direction of the British. It was ended up developing tension between the British and the United States as a result of this. Mexican-American War has a lot of, underlying notions about the whole spread of slavery and cotton into those regions of Texas. And we're kind of running out of time. We're actually, 11:21? So let me see. I got
You're technically over.
I'm over? All right.
Well, Neil, I have to go because I have a meeting at 12. But I want to attempt to answer a question that you asked earlier.
Yeah.
You asked, why is it that this man fascinates you so much? And why is it that he is considered a hero in your mind when, he killed a commanding officer and, those kind of things, I'm ex-military. And so, I'm very proud of the fact that I served, my country. Of course, I served at a time when it was, it wasn't what the conditions that they were serving under. But I want to attempt to answer that question for you. I can't speak for you, but, I've been teaching African-American humanities for 18 years now. And one of the questions that constantly come up when I start the class talking about the slave trade and the conditions of the slave trade and what produces, Black people, the question that always comes up is, how come we didn't fight? And we all know it's because our students in American public school system aren't taught the rebellions and things, so we know that. Yeah. But outside of knowing that, it is still a very odd question to ask, because Blacks have been so dehumanized and taught that they were less than other people, to where that question is an internalization of that idea. Because it is human nature to fight. It is human nature to revolt when your freedom is taken. It is human nature. And so without even knowing that there are rebellions, the humanity would say, somebody had to fight. Somebody had to have revolted. But because my Black students constantly ask, why didn't we fight? For me, that's an indication that they have not imbued Black people, and sometimes even themselves, with that kind of humanity. And so when you hear of people like Herman Perry, or Nat Turner, or Denmark Vesey, and people like that, when you hear about them, they give you humanity. They give Blacks humanity, because we associate rebellion with humanity. And it also instills pride in Black people today, because they get to understand themselves as human beings and not this sub race, because you don't even fight for yourself. And so I would offer that as an explanation of why people like this become heroes to Black people, and why the story is so fascinating to you and to me.
Nice. Thank you. Yeah, I was thinking that as well. And I actually wanted to end with something that I got in your class. Can I show real quick? It's actually not a quick video. It's 9 minutes long, but we'll end with that. And so I wanted to show my report card that I found with my F in history. But then I also wanted to show, that's you. And I wanted to, you remember this guy? Amiri Brown, I met him in 2000.
Yes.
So when I took your class, you showed me the speech and you read it to us. And I loved it. I didn't know a lot of the history that was in it, but I went back and I researched it. And I had to learn every single line because it was like, and I'm gonna let you guys hear it. It's called Somebody Blew Up America. This is in 2004 when I took Trent's class, and this was like 3 years after 9/11. Not even 3 years after 9/11.
He actually wrote it in November of November of 2000. Okay. 2001. It was like a month after he wrote it.
All thinking people oppose terrorism, both domestic and international. But one should not be used to cover the other. Somebody blew up America! They say it's some terrorist, some barbaric Arab in Afghanistan. It wasn't our American terrorists, it wasn't the Klan, or the skinheads, or the them that blows up nigger churches or reincarnates us on death row. It wasn't Trent Lott, or David Duke, or Giuliani, or Schindler. Helms retiring. It wasn't the gonorrhea in costume, the white sheet diseases that have murdered black people, terrorized reason and sanity, most of humanity, as they pleases. They say, who say? Who do the saying? Who is them paying? Who tell the lies? Who in disguise? Who had the slaves? Who got the bucks out the bucks? Who got fat from plantations? Who genocided Indians, tried to waste the black nation? Who lived on Wall Street, the first plantation? Who cut your nuts off? Who raped your mind? Who lynched your car? Who got the tar? Who got the feathers? Who had the match? Who set the fires? Who killed and hired? Who say they God? Still be the devil. Who the biggest only? Who the most goodest? Who do Jesus resemble? Who created everything? Who the smartest? Who the greatest? Who the richest? Who say you ugly and they the good lookingest? Who define art? Who defined science? Who made the bombs? Who made the guns? Who bought the slaves? Who sold them? Who call you them names? Who say Dahmer wasn't insane? Who? Who stole Puerto Rico? Who stole the Indies, the Philippines, Manhattan, Australia, and the Hebrides? Who forced opium on the Chinese? Who owned them buildings? Who got the money? Who think you funny? Who lock you up? Who owned the papers? Who owned the slave ship? Who run the army? Who was the fake president? Who the ruler? Who the banker? Who the devil on the real side? Who got rich from Armenian genocide? Who the biggest terrorist? Who changed the Bible? Who killed the most people? Who do the most evil? Who don't worry about survival? Who have the colonies? Who stole the most land? Who rule the world? Who say they good but only do evil? Who the biggest executioner? Who? Who own the oil? Who want more oil? Who told you what you think that later you find out is a lie? Oh. Who found Bin Laden? Maybe they Satan. Who paid the CIA? Who knew the bomb was gonna blow? Who know where the terrorists learned to fly in Florida, in San Diego? Who knew why 5 Israelis was filming the explosion, cracking their sides at the notion? Who need fossil fuel when the sun ain't going nowhere? Who make the credit cards? Who get the biggest tax cut? Who walked out of the conference against racism? Who killed Malcolm, Kennedy and his brother? Who killed Dr. King? Who would want such a thing? Are they linked to the murder of Lincoln? Who invaded Grenada? Who made money from apartheid? Who keep the Irish a colony? Who overthrew Chile and Nicaragua later? Who killed David Sebeco, Chris Hani, the same ones who killed Biko, Cabral, Neruda, Allende, Che Guevara, Sandino? Who killed Kabila, the ones who wasted Lumumba, Manlane, Betty Shabazz, Princess Di, Ralph Featherstone, Little Bobby? Locked up Mandela, Deruba, Geronimo, Asada, Mumia, Garlow, Yashel Hammond, Althea Sutton. Who killed Huey Newton, Fred Hampton, Medgar Evers, Mikey Smith, Walter Rodney? Was it the ones who tried to poison Fidel? Who tried to keep the Vietnamese oppressed? Who put a price on Lenin's head? Who put the Jews in ovens? And who helped them do it? Who said America first and okayed the yellow stars? Ho, ho! Who killed Rosa Luxemburg, Liebknecht? Who murdered the Rosenbergs? And all the good people iced, tortured, assassinated, banished? Who got rich from Algeria, Libya, Haiti, Iran, Iraq, Saudi, Kuwait, Lebanon, Syria, Egypt, Jordan, Palestine? Who cut off people's hands in the Congo? Who invented AIDS? Who put the germs in the Indians' blankets? Who thought up the Trail of Tears? Who blew up the Maine and started the Spanish-American War? Who got Sharon back in power? Who backed Batista, Hitler, Bilbo, Chiang Kai-shek? Who decided affirmative action had to go? Reconstruction, the New Deal, the New Frontier, the Great Society. Who do Tom S. Clarence work for? Who do come out the colon's mouth? Who know what kind of skeezer is a Condoleezza? Who pay Connolly to be a wooden Negro? Who give genius awards to Homo locus subsidiary? Who overthrew Nkrumah, Bishop? Who poisoned Robeson? Who tried to put Du Bois in jail? Who framed Rap, Jamil Alameen? Who framed the Rosenbergs, Garvey, the Scottsboro Boys, the Hollywood 10? Who set the Reichstag fire? Who knew the World Trade Center was going to get bombed? Who told 4,000 Israeli workers at the Twin Towers to stay home that day? Why did Sharon stay away? Who? Explosion of owl, the newspapers say. Devil's face could be seen. Explosion of owl, the newspapers say the devil's face could be seen. Who? Who make money from war? Who make dough from fear and lies? Who want the world like it is? Who want the world to be ruled by imperialism and national oppression and terror, violence and hunger and poverty? Who is the ruler of hell? Who is the ruler of hell? Who is the most powerful? Who you know ever seen God? But everybody's seen the devil. Like an owl exploding in your life, in your brain, in yourself. like an owl who know the devil all night, all day if you listen, like an owl exploding in fire, like an owl exploding in your life, in your brain, in yourself, like an owl who know the devil all night, all day if you listen, like an owl exploding in fire. We hear the questions rise in terrible flame like the whistle of a crazy dog, like the acid vomit of the fire of hell. Who and who and who,
Yeah, the first time I heard that was Professor Domingo, summer of 2004. And I loved it. Any questions?
Thank you, Dr. Vaz. I'm going to get the book. I need to leave because I have a meeting. Thank
All
you
right.
for this. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Great job, Neil. I think most of us have to go because we have that meeting.
I know. What is the meeting at 12?
12:30.
12:30? All right.
Yeah.
Thanks, Neil.
Thank you. It was very touching. It was very interesting.
Very, very good. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you.
Nice, Neil. See you guys later.
All right. See ya.
Neil, I just have a question in terms of your letter F, your grade F in that course. So now that you look back and have all this passion about this subject, we have grew up so much. So that's the beauty of it, right?
Yeah. I often forget that little boy. I'm like, who was that guy? Because I literally used to sit there and just not pay attention at all. Class was so boring, and nothing that we learned ever interested me.
There was no connection. There was we didn't see ourselves in those classes.
No, but when I took Trent Domingo's class, and he gave that speech right there by Mary Baraka.
Yeah,
that's just a piece of it. Like his whole class was like that. Those kinds of things resonated with me, and I was like,
yes, and that's what we need to do, right? And you went through that experience, so I think it's a great learning for us to keep that in mind in our classroom at this moment.
Yeah, so that's why when I teach, I usually give like polarizing arguments in a historical controversy. And then I have the students decide which side they're going to take, and we'll debate it. And so it's not really me. It's because I don't want to be like impose my views on anybody. But at the same time, if people see the other side, it's always a good thing. But
it's always a good thing. Yeah.
In public school, they don't really tell it another side. It's just like, this is how it is.
This is how it is.
Yeah.
And I want to ask you, when you got that F, did any of your teachers approach to you or to your mom, or to say, hey, Neil is not doing so good?
Yeah, they did.
Saying some kind of follow up.
I had a parent teacher conference. I had a couple of them, and they said I might have ADHD. My mom was like, no, he doesn't. He just needs to relax and sit out and do his work.
But it's good to know that there was some kind of meeting to, a follow-up meeting, even though they want to provide you with a diagnosis, right?
Yeah,
but that's the problem with the public education system. As soon as a Black student is having issues, it must be a learning disability. There must be something wrong with them.
Yeah. Yeah.
But sometimes they don't even approach the parents.
Yeah, that's true too.
Yeah, sometimes it's until the report card gets home and I look at it and I'm like, what? How you have a student in your class that is failing and you haven't, reached out to the family members. you know, or someone, you know, to say, hey, because it takes a whole semester to fail, not the last week to fail.
Yeah. No, you're right.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I did have some teachers that I think showed like they cared, but they just couldn't really relate, you know. And then other teachers, they didn't care at all. So
yeah. Well, thank you so much. I'm happy with all these talks. They are great. So very, very good. You're a great storyteller. Yeah.
bro, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
That was all new to me. So I felt like I was like stumbling and stuff, but I just learned the story so recently that it's like, I'm still like trying to like put it all in perspective and, you know, but yeah, thank you.
And you mentioned a topic that I make a comment that please explore that next topic related to medicine and because I will be very interesting to know more about that.
Oh, the book, Harriet Washington.
Yes.
Medical apartheid.
Medical apartheid. Yes.
Yeah. That's this is, so a lot of what I was reading in here, I was like connecting to some of the stuff I was seeing in here. And that could be a whole different presentation in itself.
Yes. Yeah. So go for it.
All right.
Yes, that will be very interesting for me. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I have another one.
All right.
Bye.
Thank you, Neil. That was awesome.
All right. Thank you. Thanks for coming.